Late at night, in a small Soviet apartment near a nuclear research center, a man in his 40s sits at a desk covered with papers. On one stack, there are handwritten notes about protein biosynthesis and the biology of aging. On another, there are pages full of neat Russian script describing something far more dangerous than enzymes or cells. He is writing about lies. He is writing about a lie that has poisoned Soviet science for decades, ruined harvests, ruined careers, and gotten good men killed. He is writing about how one man, Trofim Lysenko, rose to the top of Soviet biology by telling Stalin exactly what Stalin wanted to hear. In a different country, a scientist who exposes bad theories is rewarded. In the United States, if you prove that your field's hero is wrong, there might be bruised egos, but you get tenure, grants, maybe even a Nobel Prize. In the Soviet Union, exposing lies can get you labeled insane. The man at the desk is Zhores Medvedev. He is not a nobody. He is a respected biologist, known for his work on protein synthesis and the biology of aging, published in serious journals, invited to international conferences. His twin brother, Roy, is a historian whose books are read quietly by people tired of official myths. But tonight, Zhores is doing something that is not supposed to happen in his country. He is telling the truth about the system that feeds him. He does not own a photocopier. Those are rare and guarded in the Soviet Union. He does not have a word processor. There are no desktop computers in private apartments. Every line must be typed with a mechanical typewriter, every page copied with carbon paper, every extra copy a small act of defiance. In American universities, professors churn out manuscripts on IBM typewriters and soon on early computers. Their drafts are photocopied in minutes. Their galleys are sent to publishers by reliable airmail. In the USSR, every extra copy of a manuscript is a potential piece of evidence for the KGB. Zhores knows all this. He keeps writing. His book will be called, in the West, The Rise and Fall of T.D. Lysenko. It will tell the story of how a man with almost no scientific training convinced Stalin that he had found a shortcut to agricultural abundance, how he attacked genetics as a bourgeois science, how he used secret police in party connections to destroy careers, close labs, and send real scientists to prison camps. It will also show something else, something more subtle, how a whole scientific establishment can be bent to serve ideology, and how fear can replace peer review. In the United States, scientists argue in journals, at conferences, sometimes on TV. They form rival schools of thought, but the weapon is data, not the secret police. In the USSR, you can lose more than an argument. You can lose your freedom. When Zhores finishes his manuscript, no Soviet publisher wants to touch it. Editors understand that to print this book is to challenge a chapter of official history. Lysenko may be out of favor now, but he was once a favorite of Stalin. To say he was a fraud is to admit that the system rewarded frauds. So the book begins to circulate in samizdat, in the underground. Typed copies are passed quietly from hand to hand, from lab to lab, from friend to friend. Somehow, one copy makes it to the West. In 1969, in New York, Columbia University Press publishes The Rise and Fall of T.D. Lysenko in English. American scientists read it with a mix of horror and grim satisfaction. For years, they had suspected that something was fundamentally wrong with Soviet biology. Now, a Soviet insider is telling them exactly how deep the rot goes. The book makes headlines. It embarrasses the Kremlin. It shows that the mighty Soviet scientific machine, often praised in propaganda for Sputnik and spacewalks, is capable of believing things about plants and genes that would not survive one good seminar at an American university. And it has consequences. Back in the USSR, Zhores is fired from his research position. The man who studied aging and protein synthesis is now officially unemployed. He is blacklisted for travel. Invitations from American and European colleagues pile up, and he cannot go. That might have been the end of his story, a quiet, internal exile. But Zhores is stubborn. Cut off from the lab bench, he turns fully to writing. He writes about science and borders, arguing that real research cannot flourish when scientists are locked behind political frontiers. He writes about postal secrecy, pointing out that the Soviet Constitution promises the privacy of correspondence, while the KGB routinely opens and reads mail. He writes, in Russian, a deeper version of his Lysenko book, which spreads among Soviet scientists like a forbidden textbook. Every new page he produces is more evidence for the secret police. They watch his apartment, they track who visits him, his name appears in reports. Somewhere in the files of the KGB, someone writes down a dangerous conclusion. He is not just a scientist, he is a dissident. On a late spring night in 1970, the quiet in Obninsk is broken by heavy footsteps on the stairs. There is a knock on the door. Zhores opens it to find not only policemen, but also the director of the psychiatric hospital in the nearby city of Kaluga. They inform him that there are concerns about his mental health and that he must come with them for an examination. He is not being charged with a crime. He is not being taken to a police station. He is being taken to a mental hospital. In a free society, psychiatry is supposed to help people who cannot tell reality from hallucination, who are a danger to themselves or others. In the Soviet Union, it has developed a new category of illness. The illness is believing that the system needs to change. Within hours, Zhores finds himself behind the walls of the Kaluga Psychiatric Hospital. The doors lock behind him. The smell of disinfectant and institutional food fills the corridors. He is assigned a bed, watched by nurses who see patients, not citizens. Doctors begin to question him. They ask about his writings. Why did you write about Lysenko? Why do you criticize the postal system? Why do you talk about reform? He answers as a scientist and as a citizen. He says that false theories must be exposed, that laws must be respected, that society must improve. They write in their notes, paranoid delusions of reforming the society. In the jargon of Soviet political psychiatry, this is almost a textbook case. A sane man who has seen enough of the world to know that his country could do better becomes an enemy, not because he is wrong, but because he is right at the wrong time. In another country, in the same year, psychiatrists are studying new medications, new therapies, talking to patients about their feelings. In America, doctors are debating how to handle the wave of veterans from Vietnam with trauma, experimenting with group therapy, pushing boundaries and understanding the human mind. In this hospital in Kaluga, modern psychiatry is less important than loyalty. For 19 days, Zhores is held inside. He is subjected to repeated interviews. He observes other patients. He tries to figure out whether the doctors truly believe their own diagnoses or whether they are simply following orders. He realizes that some of them have learned to split their minds, clinician on the surface, instrument of the state underneath. He is in a dangerous limbo. If the wrong committee signs the wrong piece of paper, he could be sent to a special psychiatric hospital run by the Ministry of the Interior, a place where treatments include powerful drugs, isolation, and sometimes electroshock, not for the patient's benefit, but to break their will. Thousands of miles away, in the United States, people get into heated arguments over politics at dinner tables, in newspaper columns, on TV talk shows. Some of them believe that their government lies. Some of them write books calling entire administrations corrupt or incompetent. No one suggests they be locked in a hospital until they stop wanting reform. Inside Kaluga, Zhores recognizes that what is happening to him is not an aberration, but part of a broader pattern. The Soviet state has discovered that psychiatry can be a more subtle weapon than open prison. If you sentence a dissident in a criminal trial, you admit that there is such a thing as political opposition. If you declare a dissident insane, you turn his ideas into symptoms. You tell the world and your own citizens that only a crazy person would challenge your rule. The message is clear. Disagree with the party, and they won't argue with you. They'll medicate you. But something happens that the KGB and the doctors did not expect. People on the outside hear what has happened. Among those people are some of the most respected scientists and writers in the Soviet Union. Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb turned human rights defender, learns that Zhores Medvedev has been locked up in a psychiatric ward. He knows exactly why. He knows that this is a test case for the weaponization of medicine. He writes letters to the authorities protesting the abuse. He discusses the case with other academicians. Quietly but firmly, he organizes pressure. The writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, already famous in the West for exposing the Gulag, raises his voice as well. Others join in. They may disagree on many things, on socialism, on capitalism, on how the USSR should change, but they agree on this. Using psychiatry to silence a scientist is unacceptable. For a regime used to obedience, this kind of solidarity is a problem. The authorities begin to weigh costs and benefits. Keeping Medvedev confined might silence him, but it could also turn him into a cause célèbre, not only abroad, but inside the Soviet Academy of Sciences. After 19 days, they decide that the safest course, for now, is retreat. Doctors reverse themselves. The official story becomes that his mental state does not require compulsory treatment. Doors open, papers are signed. On June 17, 1970, Zhores walks out of the psychiatric hospital and returns home. Andrei Sakharov later calls this release the greatest success of a civic campaign in many years. It shows that if enough people inside the system push back, even the KGB can be forced to blink. But the story does not end there. Shortly after his release, officials hint that the diagnosis remains on his file, that he is still under observation. They suggest that if he causes more trouble, he can always be brought back. It is the equivalent of an invisible gun pointed at his head. In the United States, a scientist who criticizes government policy may lose a grant, may get angry letters from politicians, may even be investigated if national security is involved, but no one can legally tag them as insane and drag them to a hospital for thinking about reform. For Zhores, this threat becomes a challenge. He decides that the best way to protect himself and others like him is to expose exactly what happened in painstaking detail. He records everything down. He records the night of his arrest, the conversations with doctors, the diagnoses, the phrases they used, the way they tried to twist his scientific concerns into symptoms of a psychosis. His twin brother, Roy, adds chapters that frame the story, explaining the political context, the family background, the reaction of friends and colleagues. Together, they produce a manuscript called A Question of Madness. It is smuggled out of the country and, like the Lysenko book before it, lands in the hands of Western publishers. In 1971, A Question of Madness appears abroad. Readers in the United States and Europe are introduced to a chilling idea. In the Soviet Union, dissent has been medicalized. Human rights organizations and medical associations take note. For Western psychiatrists, this is a moral shock. The idea that their profession, the care of the mind, could be twisted into a tool of tyranny is almost unbearable. In psychiatric journals and conferences, the case of Zhores Medvedev is discussed alongside other reports coming out of the USSR about sluggish schizophrenia, a diagnosis invented to label people who function perfectly well but harbor dangerous political ideas, about special hospitals where patients receive endless injections of powerful drugs for the crime of wanting to write or to worship. The story forces Western doctors to ask themselves, what is the duty of a physician in a system that demands political loyalty over medical ethics? As this debate spreads, the Soviet leadership faces a new kind of embarrassment. The very word psychiatry is now associated in Western newspapers with repression. Every time a Soviet diplomat attends a World Psychiatric Association meeting, someone brings up cases like Medvedev's. For a regime that wants Western technology, Western trade, Western recognition, this reputational damage matters. The KGB takes note. They may still use psychiatric hospitals as weapons, but they now understand that each case could explode into an international scandal. The cost of abuse has gone up. In the middle of this, Zhores continues to live in the Soviet Union. He keeps writing. He keeps thinking. He remains, in the eyes of the authorities, a troublesome man. Then, in 1972, something surprising happens. He receives permission to travel to London to work at the National Institute for Medical Research. After years of being refused foreign travel, this feels like an opening. He goes. In London, he sees firsthand what Western science looks like from the inside. He walks through modern labs filled with equipment that his colleagues in Moscow can only dream of. Centrifuges, spectrophotometers, cold rooms, incubators. He sees how easily British and American researchers share data. He attends seminars where controversial ideas are debated openly with no fear of political consequences. He visits bookstores stacked with scientific monographs, including some of his own, published in translation and sold without any thought that their content might be sensitive. For him, the contrast is dizzying. In the USSR, a Xerox machine is a dangerous object. In London, photocopiers stand in the hallways of universities, churning out articles that criticize governments, institutions, even the very premises of big scientific projects. In the USSR, international cooperation in science is either tightly controlled or discouraged. In the West, it is assumed. Research papers list authors from multiple countries. Conferences are filled with accents. For the Soviet Union's rulers, this open, networked culture of science is a threat. They know they cannot fully replicate it without loosening political control. While Zhores is still in London, the men in Moscow make a calculation. They do not want him back. In 1973, the Soviet government revokes his citizenship. One day, he is a Soviet citizen temporarily in Britain. The next day, he is a man without a country, an exile. He cannot go home, he cannot return to his lab, his apartment, his old life. The message to anyone back in the USSR who might be paying attention is clear. If you are too independent, if you speak too loudly, we can erase you. We can make you into a non-person. From a Cold War game theory perspective, it is an odd move. The Soviets are, in effect, giving their critics direct access to Western audiences, free of travel restrictions. From Zhores's perspective, exile is both loss and opportunity. He settles in the United Kingdom. He takes positions as a researcher and later as a visiting scientist and writer. He continues to write about the Soviet system, but now with a new vantage point. He writes The Medvedev Papers, The Plight of Soviet Science Today, a book that lays out for Western readers how censorship, ideology, and bureaucracy distort research in his homeland. He describes labs starved of equipment, brilliant students forced into politically safe topics, conferences where only approved results can be presented. He writes Soviet Science, exploring the links between the scientific establishment and the military, showing how entire fields exist mainly to serve the weapons complex. He writes Soviet Agriculture, tracing the ongoing problems in food production back to ideological blindness, including the legacy of Lysenko's war on genetics. He also does something that makes intelligence analysts in Langley, Virginia, and in European capitals sit up and take notice. He starts reading Soviet scientific journals for clues to something that officially did not exist, a nuclear disaster. In the mid-1970s, scattered rumors and fragmentary information suggest that sometime in the late 1950s, there was a major nuclear accident in the Soviet Union's Ural region. No details are available. The Kremlin denies everything. Most experts dismiss these rumors as Cold War paranoia, But Zhores has learned that in a system built on secrecy, scientific literature sometimes reveals more than it should. He reads and reads and reads. He combs through dozens of Soviet papers on radiation biology, ecology, and health, looking for patterns. He finds studies that mention a certain district where livestock show increased mutations, a closed region where trees and soil show strange isotopic signatures, reports of evacuations that are never fully explained. Step by step, he pieces together a puzzle. He notices that one paper about contaminated lakes mentions a specific number of fish. Another mentions the size of a herd of deer in a test area. He cross-checks these numbers with publicly available geographic and ecological data. He maps likely locations where such lakes and herds exist. Slowly, a picture emerges. In 1957, near a secret nuclear facility in the southern Urals, a storage tank of radioactive waste exploded. The blast released a massive amount of radioactivity into the environment. A plume of contamination spread over hundreds of square kilometers. Entire villages were quietly evacuated. People were relocated, their old homes bulldozed. On maps, the area became a blank. Western governments had hints of this event from spy satellites and intelligence agents, but no solid public proof. Now, a Soviet scientist in exile is showing with open sources that the disaster happened and roughly where. In 1979, he publishes The Nuclear Disaster in the Urals. Many Western commentators are skeptical at first. The idea that the Soviets could have a nuclear disaster on that scale without the world knowing seems far-fetched. But Zhores has copious references. He lists articles, tables, maps. He shows that the contamination could not have been deliberate experiments, as some Soviet authors coyly suggest, but must have come from a specific incident. A decade later, during Gorbachev's glasnost, the Soviet government finally admit that a serious accident did occur in 1957 at the Mayak nuclear complex near a town called Kishtim. Once again, Medvedev was right. He had done something the Soviet system itself could not do: use scientific openness to expose a dangerous truth.
Under Gorbachev, some of the practices Zhores had exposed begin to be dismantled. Political abuse of psychiatry decreases under international pressure. The word Lysenko becomes embarrassing, a cautionary tale. Soviet citizens finally hear in their own media about accidents like Kishtim and the true scale of Chernobyl. In 1990, his Soviet citizenship is restored. Publishers in Moscow start to print his books, some of them for the first time in Russian on home soil. He does not rush back. He stays in Britain, visiting the new Russia, but keeping his base in the country that gave him refuge and a platform when his own government tried to declare him insane. When he dies in London in 2018, at the age of 93, obituaries in American and British papers describe him as a dissident scientist who was incarcerated in a Soviet psychiatric hospital and as a man who exposed not just one injustice, but an entire pattern of how authoritarian regimes corrupt science. For Americans, his story holds a particular kind of fascination. It is a story about a man who loved science enough to risk his freedom for it. It is a story about how a system that tried to match American rockets and bombs could not bring itself to accept American rules of open inquiry, peer review, and honest data. It is a story about how the Soviet Union, for all its tanks and missiles, was terrified of something as simple as a photocopier in the wrong hands, a typewriter in the wrong apartment, a psychiatrist who refused to sign a false diagnosis. During World War II, Americans saw newsreels of German generals studying American tanks and planes with grudging respect, recognizing that U.S. industry and engineering had outpaced them. In the Cold War, there was a different kind of gap. On paper, Soviet labs could build nuclear weapons, but in many fields, computers, microelectronics, consumer technology, they lagged years behind. More importantly, they lacked the culture that allowed a man like Zhores Medvedev to stand up in a seminar and say,
"Comrade, your theory is wrong," without fearing for his job or his sanity. When people in the United States watching this history now, there is pride to be taken in that difference. Pride that in American laboratories, young researchers argue with Nobel laureates without worrying that a disagreement will end with a diagnosis. Pride that American psychiatrists, when they abuse their power, are held accountable by independent courts and press, not rewarded with promotions for serving the state. Pride that American engineers and scientists, free to share their work with the world, helped create the communications infrastructure that made it impossible to hide disasters like Kishtim and Chernobyl forever. But there is also a warning. The tools that made it easier for Zhores Medvedev to get his story out, photocopiers, printing presses, broadcast technology, are ancestors of the tools that connect us today. Those tools can be used to spread truth or to amplify lies. They can make it easier to hold power accountable or to drown uncomfortable facts in noise. Zhores' life reminds us that the line between science and propaganda is not drawn in silicon or steel. It is drawn in human choices. When he sat at that desk in Obninsk, typing up his critique of Lysenko, he knew that he was challenging more than one man's bad theory. He was challenging a whole way of thinking about knowledge, a way that put ideology above evidence. When police knocked on his door in 1970 and dragged him to a mental hospital, they were sending a message not only to him, but to every scientist in the country. When he walked out 19 days later, thanks to the courage of people like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, he showed that science and conscience can push back even in the darkest conditions. And when he lived out the rest of his life in a country where no one ever called him insane for wanting reform, he proved that in the long run, a system that trusts its scientists and citizens will always out-innovate and outlast a system that fears them. In the great contest of the Cold War, careers and lives like his were part of the reason why one side ultimately prevailed, not just on the battlefield, but in the laboratory, the newsroom, and perhaps most importantly, in the quiet space where a human being asks, "What is true?" and refuses to let anyone else answer that question for him.